we can just kind of give some tangible examples, if we go through it one by one. So a woman who is pregnant and is going through a fairly normal pregnancy medically, what actually is the bare minimum that they should do to keep active? What would you say that would be?
Okay, so I would say that walking is a really, I mean, firstly, I should start by saying I couldn't say what is the bare minimum, because for some women during pregnancy, if you are experiencing some complications, you might be on bed rest. So
Yeah.
there can be certain complications. But if we're talking about generally
The
a straight,
general avatar of pregnancy,
yeah,
they want to be active, but they don't really know what to do. What's the bare minimum?
okay.
We're not
So
talking about extremities.
So I would say walking is a really great place to start. You want to make sure that you're choosing routes where there's a minimal risk of falling. So, not too much uneven ground, but getting outside, getting walking, getting fresh air into your body, brilliant place to start. And then we know that there are really great benefits to strength training as well during pregnancy. So if that's something you're interested in, starting with body weight exercises. And then there are amendments that we can make as pregnancy progresses. So generally, the first trimester, they say you can continue training as you always have, throughout that first trimester. Some women experience morning sickness. It might not be something that you are able to do. My first trimesters, I was pretty much under the duvet feeling sick the whole time. But if you can, walking, body weight exercises, great. But then I would say in the first trimester, it's not just about what you can do. It is about, well, what's the best thing? So for example, people always ask me, like, can I do a sit-up still? You could, the guidelines say, yes, you can do a sit-up in the first trimester, but then you have to think about what's really the benefit of a sit-up. There's so many better core exercises that we can do for our body that work the whole core. So I wouldn't necessarily prescribe that to somebody.
So what would you prescribe?
Gosh, there's so many other core exercises that I would do. It depends obviously of your level, but something like the bridge, something like the bird dog exercise. We can do a plank, a modified plank on our knees. There's so many other exercises that we can do that can help to work the core that isn't a crunch or a sit up. But so that's kind of first trimester. Then we progress through to the second trimester. And as the pregnancy progresses, as your bump grows, and we have this separation of the rectus abdominis muscle, which is the six-pack muscle at the front of your abdominal wall, and it moves out to the side in order for that bump to grow. Then there might be things later on in the second, towards the end of the second, maybe towards the end of the third trimester. Again, it depends on your body and how your bump is developing. But it might be that you find things uncomfortable. You might find it uncomfortable to be on your hands and knees because that pressure on the front of your abdominal wall just feels uncomfortable. In which case, we can do things like elevate our arms up onto a bench or a sofa so that we are in that sort of elevated position with that diagonal line. There's so many ways that we can amend exercise, but I would say from a beginner level, walking, body weight exercises, you might choose to work with a resistance band. And then if you are more experienced, dumbbells, and I know you wanted to get to, what kind
if
of
we then
the
have
limit.
this avatar of, okay, really active before pregnancy, what should they do? What's the max they should do in terms of being safe?
So again, what makes working with pre and postnatal women so difficult is that I could not tell you stop here. What I can say is I would avoid any sports, like contact sports, kickboxing, rugby. I wouldn't recommend high contact sports when you're pregnant. Or sports like horse riding where there's a risk of falling. I mean, women do horse riding, but that's not something I would advise if you're pregnant. And then, so my biggest guideline would be both with strength and with cardio exertion, like how hard you're working or how heavy you're lifting. Yeah. I would say maximum 70%. So in that second trimester, I would say if you're lifting weights overhead, I'd be lifting maximum 70% of what you usually would lift. Same with like energy expenditure for cardio. If you're going for a run or you like to sprint on the track, I'd be working at like a 70% maximum in the second trimester. And then towards the end of the third trimester, I dropped that down to 50%. So it's not necessarily, sometimes people say, oh, don't try anything new in pregnancy. I wouldn't say that, because for some women, keeping active is completely new. So it's going to be new. But I would say it's not about pushing boundaries. I wouldn't necessarily advise pushing a boundary of your comfort level, or really overexerting yourself to try to reach that PB. Those are things that I would say we can build the foundations for that in the postpartum period and achieve that later down the line.
Yeah, absolutely. It's interesting how you say that people can try new things, obviously with precautions put in, because as you said earlier, it might be a period of time where people suddenly are thinking about their pelvic floor, they're thinking about their core for the first time, because suddenly, obviously, you use both of those things in your body every day, but there's a bit more pressure on them. There's a bit more, performance or maybe recovery as we get to the postpartum discussion. But yeah, it's interesting that actually it could be the first time that someone's thinking, hold on, I want to move my body. I want to actually be able to recover from that. I want to optimize this labor if I can do. And they tune in with their body, because that's a completely different discussion to, you're never going to feel like yourself again, you're going to feel so broken, to actually thinking, how can I help my body? How can I help it? Not in a performance optimization way, but just in a necessarily like checking in with how I'm feeling. If I tense my core, do I actually feel my core? Like, what do I feel? If I stand up with my posture, like, are my shoulders back? Like, how do I feel in that way? And just checking in, because then I think that'll really check in mindfully as well and mentally. I've just been like, okay, where am I now? I'm not thinking about what I'm going to do in 10 minutes or 10 days or whatever is going to happen. I guess if you're going through pregnancy, what's going to happen in a few months, or all of that kind of spiraling out of whether it's anxiety, excitement, whatever it could be, but just tuning in.
I think you mentioned their posture, and I think that's really important to mention as well. Sorry, when we're looking at minimum exercise or exercises that I would really recommend women do, I would say that, again, if you're new to exercise, you might prefer to work with a trainer that specializes in pre and postnatal, but deep core exercises are also really beneficial during pregnancy that will help us with our postpartum recovery. I would also recommend exercises that work the glutes. So we have a tilt in the pelvis during pregnancy. As the bump expands, your pelvis is sort of shifted forwards. If you can imagine, like a bowl of water, if you tip the milk out the front of the bowl, your pelvis shifts forwards in that way as the bump, doesn't pull it forwards, but as the bump expands, the pelvis shifts. And working the whole core. So without going into too much detail, we have different layers in our abdominals, and there's a really deep muscle called the transverse abdominis, and it wraps around your torso almost like a corset. So underneath that six-pack muscle, we've got our obliques, and then under there we've got this transverse abdominis, or the TVA. And that muscle can really help us to stabilize our entire torso. It helps us to stabilize the pelvis. It works very closely with the pelvic floor. So exercises, I know I've already mentioned the bridge and the bird dog exercise, modified planks, really great movements, pelvic tilt exercises, which you can do lying on the floor, or you can do them standing if you're further on in pregnancy and lying on your back is uncomfortable. Leg slide exercise, things like that really help to work the deep core, really important. And glute exercises like glute kickbacks, or, if you've got a resistance band, doing exercises, something like the clam with or without a resistance band, really great to work the glutes, which will help us to reestablish that the optimum pelvic position after pregnancy, because it helps us to improve our posture. All of that plays a part in our posture. So you might notice that you have lower back pain in pregnancy because you've got this arch in the lower back where the pelvis has been tilted forwards and we're compressing the spine at the back. So glute exercises, again, really great to help us, alleviate some of that pressure and reset that pelvic tilt postpartum. So all of that, again, I would say, and I know it sounds like a lot, they're actually very simple exercises that you can do. I'm sharing them. I share regularly simple exercises on my social media, or it's in the book. So, but those types of exercises really important during and after pregnancy.
And to combat perhaps a myth, perhaps not a myth, are we training during this time as you work with clients? Is it to optimize, if you can optimize or maybe facilitate labor, or is it for the postpartum, or a bit of both? But is there some
Both.
sort of help that you can do for labor through training?
Yeah, both. So, I mean, again, it depends what type of labor you want. But if you want an active labor, I mean, labor's really physical. So, having a good cardiovascular system, good heart health, strong muscles, that's going to help you. If you want an active labor where you're maybe gripping onto something and you're hanging down, you might want that. You might want to be on all fours, all of that. So, yes, exercise can absolutely help us with labor preparation. A part of labor preparation, what I would say is, as much as we do want to focus on the deep core and working the pelvic floor as well during pregnancy, because again, that shift in the pelvis, if you imagine your pelvis like a bowl, when your pelvis is straight, all your like internal organs and everything, they rest equally across the bony structures of the pelvis. So it helps to support all of that weight. When the pelvis is shifted forwards, internal organs, baby, placenta, amniotic fluid, everything is shifted off that bony structure and it rests more heavily onto the pelvic floor. So that's why we often notice sort of increased pressure or pelvic floor dysfunction, urinary incontinence during pregnancy. So all of that, really important to help us rehabilitate the pelvic floor. But in labor preparation, we also want to work on some pelvic floor relaxation exercises because we want that relaxation and release to help baby descend down the birth canal. So that is also a part of labor preparation, as is having strength, upper body strength, like I said, if you want an active labor. So yes, exercise can help us prepare for labor, but exercise can also help us to have a more efficient postnatal recovery, postpartum. So both.